Welcome to Fiction and Focus, a podcast where we explore the craft of writing without taking ourselves too seriously. I'm Nathan Harms.
And I'm Wesley Watts. Each episode, we'll discuss uplifting topics like the soul-crushing pressure of expectations, the suffocating grip of self-doubt, and the swift kick in the unmentionables of rejection.
We'll share our experiences, struggles, and heartaches in the hope that you might find some small measure of comfort in our collective misery, or at least have a laugh at our expense.
So grab a pen, paper, and your favorite writing snack, and join us as we put fiction in focus.
Welcome, word nerds, to Fiction in Focus. I am Nathan Harms, and we have Wesley Watts here, as you just heard in the intro, of course. Welcome to our first episode.
Yeah, inaugural podcast. So it's going to be a mess.
This is the one we look back on, a year from now and say, man, we were so bad at this. And then we go, wow, we didn't get any better.
No, we didn't.
This is peak right here. Well, welcome to our tens of listeners, ones of listeners. Hi, Mom. Whoever's listening to start with, or if we're further on down our journey and you have gone back to hear where we started, it gets better. If you're going back, you're listening to us on 40, and we're really good and we're funny, and you're like, I want to see where these guys started. It gets better. We promise. Hopefully. So to start us off, before we go into today's subject, I want to kick it around so we can kind of introduce ourselves a little bit more, why we're here, why you should maybe or maybe not listen to us, whatever the case may be, and kind of what brought us together to do this. So Wesley, you want to start us off?
Sure. I primarily write science fiction and fantasy. I've been writing for a very long time with a big chunk of a hiatus that I'm sure at some point in this podcast we'll probably go into and talk about more, but that's a long drawn out story for another day. But I've written probably around 6 full-length novels now, short stories, flash fiction, good chunk of other stuff like that. I've got one published right now under this pen name and working on the sequel.
The follow-up.
Yeah. What about you?
It's a beautiful thing. So I've been writing for about 7 years now. Prior to that, I did music, so it's still writing, but, on the lyrical landscape of things. And kind of started out doing kids' books just for fun with my brother doing illustrations. Enjoyed doing that. Did 8 books of that. Decided, I want to do something a little bit longer form, so got into young reader science fiction with our Zed and Zia series, which is now on book 4. And then even beyond that, said, I really want to write something for grown-ups, essentially. Not that kind of grown-up writing, not adult, but decided to write a lot of gothic fiction novellas. And that just kind of snowballed from there to the point where it took over most of my life. We do a lot of conventions. We are constantly writing, me and my brother, and releasing stuff. And yeah, it's just become kind of my favorite thing to talk about and do. And I guess that's kind of why we're here a little bit.
Yeah, that's exactly why we're here. We both live, breathe, and talk this stuff all the time. So,
oh yeah, doesn't mean we know anything, but
no.
We like to, we like to learn things.
Actually, that raises a question here. So this is off the cuff. We neither of us planned this, but maybe you could mention something that you do think that you humble brag that you are actually good at, and maybe something that you feel like you are not qualified to teach people at all.
Right. So my humble brag would be, I feel like more often than not, because of the way I do outlines and story structures, I usually get to stick the landing pretty well on most of my stories. The journey might be a little rough sometimes, or I'm always learning and expanding, but I feel like that final act, that final chapter, that final page before the end usually leaves the taste in everyone's mouth that I would prefer it leave. Oh, Lordy.
You said it.
Entendre. So I love story, I love structure, I love to know where I'm going, and really I write a story to get to the ending because that's the part I'm most excited about. Um, yeah, things I'm not as good at, and I'm getting better. Is honestly the finer points of grammar and just proper writing techniques, and I think that's something for a lot of writers where we really want to do it, and at first we're just dropping a comma wherever it feels like it should be there. Then we start learning actually how things are supposed to be actually inputted into the story. And that's been a learning process. I go back and I look at some of my older writings and stuff like that, and I go, oh gosh, oh, why did I do that? Why did I phrase it that way? Why did I do the things I do?
Sure.
Um,
But I mean, to give
but
yourself some credit, coming from a lyric background, that's not something you needed.
no scribbles on napkins. That's that's
Yeah,
most of the misspelled words. All about emotion and all that good stuff. So absolutely, you're absolutely right there. So it was a bit of a learning change for me, but it's something that I become really interested in, and I think that's the cool thing with writing is if you can address your strengths and your weaknesses and know which is which, and be teachable. It's a fun journey, you know. If you think you know everything, you're going to have a bad time because there's going to be someone that knows more than you, and you want to actually soak that up like a sponge and not just be resistant to new methods or ideas.
absolutely. Well said.
How about your Yeah, how about yourself?
What I can teach people, what not to do. So, like I said, I've been writing for a long time, and my first everything was just awful. My second
Mm.
everything was just awful. My third everything was okay.
Yeah.
Um, I was very lucky that I got into some writing groups early on that had just some fantastic, caring people that, for whatever reason, saw pity on me, or maybe they saw a little something, I don't know. But they actually kind of like adopted me almost and said, hey, there's something here, but you've got a long way to go, and here's how to do that. I had a really good writing mentor that she actually won some awards back in the day. Met her on Twitter. We became good friends for years. Um, you know, just was surrounded by really intelligent people that are better at this than I am. So I absorbed as much of that as I can and learned from it. I can regurgitate some of that, put my own spin on some of it. So most of that knowledge that I owe to other people. And what I cannot teach is motivation. I need somebody to teach me that. I write best when I write every day, but I don't do that. I struggle with that. Things get in the way. I let things get in the way. Which is why that, although that I've been doing this for a very long time, you have much more out than I do. I'm not prolific, but that's something I'm working on. I'm getting better. So,
That's good. We'll have to have a future episode just all about motivation.
oh
That
yeah,
could probably be like an 8-part series.
in which I say almost nothing.
It's just me shaming you for 30 minutes an episode.
Well, maybe we can bring on another host too for that, so that I can get shamed by two people.
I love that.
All right.
Get a motivational speaker on here. So I guess so what are we going to be talking about here today, Wesley?
So today we are starting what will end up being a series on story structure. So
Yay.
we'll be touching on this off and on for a while. I'm sure we'll do episodes on other topics as well. But yeah, we've got a couple of story structures to talk about today that are kind of near and dear to our heart.
Absolutely.
I'm going to start with kind of a quick overview on like why do you need story structure, right? Like,
Hmm.
can you just sit down and write? There's that whole plotter versus pantser thing.
Oh yeah.
But I would actually argue that pantsers need to understand story structure even better than a plotter does. That Yeah, they need to be able to do that instinctively. They need to know it in and out, back their hand. because they're not writing down beforehand. They're not tweaking it, moving their note cards around, or however they do that. So,
Hmm. Absolutely. No, I mean, I think it's funny talk about plotter versus pantser, and uh, I think everybody who starts writing always wants to be a pantser up front. This is something I've felt myself, and when you have someone saying I want to write a book, they're like, I'm going to sit down and it's going to be this grandiose thing. I'm going to turn on the classical music and dim the lights, light some candles, get a glass of wine, sit there with my old typewriter, and just knock out the great American novel. And then they get 4 pages into it, and they've already, they've lost their way. They have no idea where they're going. It started as a comedy, now it's a horror, and by the end of it, it's going to be, some for the history books. Um, but it's ironic because I think the people who are pantsers, and they are pantsers, I think there's a little bit of a lie in there in the sense of I think they do know where they're going somewhat. I think they have at least the semblance of an idea in their head, and although they might not know where it's going exactly, there's something that's inspiring them to write that story. And where most people get hung up in that is getting themselves in the corner. And that's why, like you said, knowing story structure, what kind of story are you going to tell? Because that's really going to be a thing. If you're a pantser, the difference between a short story novella and a novel is a lot of words. And so if you've already hit the third act and you're 20,000 words in, um, where do you go from there?
yeah.
Um, Tricky. I couldn't do. I love the idea of it. It is not me. You know.
No, me neither. I need now. I do actually pants some things, so I can't say I'm entirely a plotter, but I would say I'm 90% of a plotter.
Yeah.
Um, I would agree with you, and I wonder if some of that's just a communication thing too, because there are some really good pantsers out there.
Yeah.
So I'm not knocking on people that write like that, but I do think that you're right. I think, well, I'm pretty positive you're right because I've heard interviews and I've heard them talking about, that they've got a seed, they've got an idea of where it's going. They might not know the ending.
Right.
In fact, I've heard one of them. I don't want to name the name because I'm not 100% sure I've got that name right. But they say that they don't want to know the ending because that ruins it for them.
Is that Stephen King?
I
Because
think it was
I
Stephen
I,
King that said that. Yeah,
I don't think he knows his endings ever.
I think it was Stephen King that said that, but I'm not actually 100% positive, and I'm not sure exactly how he said
We
it.
won't we won't quote you, but as someone who's a famously apparently a pantser,
He is famously
which
a
I
pantser.
believe. Yes.
I absolutely believe it. And there's some wonderful writers out there that are like that though. And but I think some of that communication gets passed down and it's almost romanticized. And then the new writer
Yeah.
tries to get in there and tries to, just roll off the cuff with an entire novel,
Yeah.
and they get themselves into trouble and then feel like they can't write when they actually can.
Yeah.
They
Absolutely.
just needed a little bit of a roadmap to get them there. So that's kind of where
It's
I'm coming from.
yeah.
You know,
It makes you wonder how many writers out there, how many just amazing, amazing stories and novels just got written into a corner that we'll never hear. Because this kind of information, this kind of open dialogue about it wasn't necessarily available when they started writing because they had that romantic version of
yeah.
it. And
I've
how you know,
I've read a few of those, like working with other authors that are unpublished. I've worked with a few that were just fantastic storytellers, and some of them that I was kind of envious of their skill and wordplay and turns of phrases. But yeah, they would do that same thing. They would some of not all of them, of course, but some of them would have this great idea, this great start, and then just kind of lose themselves along the way. And
absolutely.
it's sad to see that when especially when you actually get invested in their story and you're like, I actually love this character.
Yeah.
What the hell, man? Like,
Well, and I think that happens a lot with people too. I meet a lot of authors when we're doing like conventions and stuff, and You'll have this guy sitting at this table. He has one book. He worked on it for 12 years. It's not really selling because, he doesn't have a lot to offer. People are more drawn into, oh, you have three books out, or whatever the case may be. It's a natural occurrence. Oh, it's part of a series. Um, but the thing is, your first book is there to suck, and your second book is there to suck less.
Yep.
And it's always progressing forward. So it's kind of like if you spend so much time getting yourself in the corner because you want to be a pantser on that first book, you're just never going to get to that second book because it's going to be such an awful experience.
Yeah.
And granted, if you're listening to this right now and you're like, no, I sit down over a weekend and I write, 50,000 words and they're perfect and don't need to be edited. You know what? Kudos to you. Contact us, please. We'd love to have you on as a guest.
Why are you
Please
listening
share.
to us?
Why? Um, but yeah, no, it's interesting. I think you're right though. It's rare that someone just picks up and goes like that. I think, if anything, if you become a pantser, I think that's not necessarily where you started either. I think to learn your craft, I think you should
Yeah.
give yourself at least a small roadmap. I know with like a lot of my gothic novellas and stuff like that, I give myself a very small roadmap. It's usually sometimes it's less than a paragraph
Yeah.
for the whole book, and that's it. And to me that's about as close to pantsing as I get. But I still know beginning, middle, end. I still know the structure of it and so on. So I'm just filling in the blanks at that point, that's the fun part, right?
Yeah.
So
Actually, before we move on, that's something I'd like to kind of just bring up is that the length of the work
yeah,
is going to, in my opinion, dictate the work that you need to do beforehand for the outline. If you are
100%.
doing a short story, well, I have pantsed entire short stories.
Right, right.
Like, if you're trying to bang out 5 to 10,000 words, that's a couple of scenes. You might not need. You might have all of that in your head at once without having to write a single word down.
Yeah,
Or you might just start writing, and stream of consciousness takes you and carries you through that. That's possible. Flash fiction, absolutely, that's possible. 500 to 1,000 words. You shouldn't need an outline for that.
right, right.
A novella, you probably need a little bit more of an outline. The novella I co-wrote, partially because we were co-writing, which I was co-writing with a pantser, but partially because we were both working on it, we needed an outline. So you need something for a full-length novel. Yeah, there's a few people out there that can do that, but I certainly am not one of them.
Yeah. I think it would just, you would never be satisfied with the ending of that. I just don't see how you would be. You get to
Yeah.
there's no way you're not disappointed by that unless it comes naturally. So, yeah. So I guess we know where we stand on pants or no pants.
Yeah. Tell us in the comments. All right.
Do you like pants?
So there's tons of story structures out there. You kind of have to decide what you're going to use. And we were going to start with a couple of our favorites, so to speak. What was the first one you want to talk about?
All right. So I think where we're going to start is probably the most widely known one, which is the 3-act story structure. This is the thing you see in a lot of books, a lot of stories, a lot of movies, even a lot of, full-length television series. 3-act structure tends to be the go-to for most writers, and it is a place where most of us start. I think when we first start writing, we're usually not going too crazy with the story, but to give a brief overview of what it is, Act 1, setup. So you're introducing main characters and settings. You're going to establish the initial conflict or problem, the stories, the path you're going to follow, and it's going to basically feature the inciting incident, which propels the story forward. So I think that first act, which is something we can talk about in future episodes especially, is kind of in a lot of ways the hardest one to write. You're doing a lot of things in that first act in the 3-act structure where you're not only world building and introducing characters and plot and getting the reader invested right off the bat. But you're doing it in one act structure, really, and not that it can't carry over into others, but that's right off the bat. And I'll go through the other two acts, and then we can chat about it. But Act Two, confrontation. Our main characters are going to face some challenges or obstacles because things can't be easy in life. There's going to be rising tension or stakes, conflicts deepen, characters hate each other, whatever, falling out happens. May include a midpoint where the characters experience a significant turning point. You know, someone dies. That's a big one. You know, you're on the brink of destruction, something you can't come back from. Obi-Wan. And then Act 3 is going to be the resolution. So it's going to be the climax of the story where that initial conflict that we talked about in Act 1 is resolved. And you have your main characters making decisions or taking decisive actions. The story is going to wrap up without any lingering effects and character development by the end of it. You know, it's just, there you go, finite. And so that's in general. Some examples of this is... name almost any movie. Not any movie, but a lot of movies. Just about. I mean, and even, it's funny, I was doing a little bit of research before today's pod, and I was realizing that even some of the other ones that we're going to end up talking about in the future still, in a weird way, follow a version of this three-act structure. It just is we've gone into more details, or we've thrown a wrench in the gears here and there.
Oh, yeah.
We've changed one little thing, but really that beginning, middle, end... is just so tried and true.
Oh yeah. So I mean, absolutely. That's when we were going through the list of like what structures we could cover. Almost all of them are variations on the 3-act structure.
Yep, absolutely.
Save the Cat. It's a more detailed version of 3-act structure.
Yep.
Dan Harmon's Story Circle. It's a version of the 3-act structure.
Yep.
The hero's journey is an interesting one because it's a 3-act structure, but it's like, it's the way the person came up with it, I forget their name. They were looking back at like old Greek stories and fables and things like that.
Yeah.
And they basically took the 3-act structure and pulled those elements out. So almost everything is the 3-act structure.
Yeah, and I think even in the non-linear, which is something I'm really excited to talk about. We're not going to do it on this episode, but in the future series, we can talk about, shattered linear narrative and stuff like that. Even within that, you're still dealing with a version of a 3-act structure where even if you have 3 characters doing 3 separate things and it's bouncing back and forth, each of their stories still has a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah.
And it's pretty cool. I think the one example of this that differs from it the most is actually the second one that we'll talk about today. In my opinion, in a weird way, that one kind of deviates the most because it's a little bit of a gotcha. You know, it's the best way to describe it.
Yeah. What would if you were going to say like the ultimate example of 3-act structure that you've personally written?
So probably for me, it's probably going to be actually like my first Gothic novella, which would be in Terra. I won't give anything away, but it's about a lost soul in a strange land who's trying to figure out who they are. And essentially, it goes through kind of the hero's journey idea, but it very much is you establish this is the character, this is where they are, and this is their journey. And then you have that moment in there about halfway through, a little bit over halfway through is usually when you have the climax of Act 2, right? And that's where the disaster, crisis, obstacle hits. And it's very hardcore for this particular character because they lose all hope. And then by the end, they make a choice that sends them onwards towards their finality. And it is a really simple idea. The one thing I'll point out that I really do like about the 3-act structure is some people would see it as a triangle, but it's not really a triangle. There's actually a steady incline. I gotta move over a little bit. Steady incline, and then kind of like that, because you can take a lot of time to get to that climax of the act
Yeah.
two. And so it's an interesting thing to write in 3 act structure because any like you said anything could be a 3 act structure. I could probably sit down with any of my stories, even the kids books, and say, oh well, yeah, there's a 3 act structure. Character wakes up, character does this thing, character goes home.
Yeah.
There's your 3 act structure. You know, as
It's
long as that's happening, it's sort of there.
and that's what I the biggest objection I've heard to outlining and using story structures is that, well, won't my story become just like everything else? I want to become
Yeah.
predictable. Predictability is not necessarily a bad thing. You want your audience to feel confident that they're in good hands and that this story is going to get resolved and they're going to
Yeah.
enjoy it. So you
Mm-hmm.
want predictability to some degree. And there's so many different ways to write the 3 act structure. It's so malleable
Oh yeah.
that, yeah, almost every story that you've ever watched or read is going to work for it.
Yeah.
There's really, yeah, there's only a few examples that it doesn't.
Well, it's interesting too because 3 act structure doesn't mean happily ever after.
No.
People confuse that a lot of times. You can have a 3 act structure that's a tragedy, or a cliffhanger, or all those things. It's really about just the journey you're taking your character on.
Yeah. And
So,
it can be an action, it can be mystery, it can be romance.
hmm when you first started writing, was that like your go-to? You've been writing for a long time, so when you first started writing, was it conscious? Was it a conscious decision for you to be like, I'm going to start with the 3 act structure, and then as you found out about other variables of that, is that when you kind of jumped onto those other ideas, or did it happen more naturally and you did something? You're like, I wonder what that's called.
So actually this next one is the example of that that we're going to talk about. But if we're going back, my first novels, first couple of novels and first short stories didn't have really any organized structure at all, which is part of, not the only reason, but part of why they were so awful. But basically, I just didn't know what I was doing. I was just sitting down, I was putting words down, and you know, most of them were the wrong words. Eventually, when I wrote the first book I published under my old pen name, like 12 years ago or so, that one I had found this software online that you can't even get anymore called Contour, and
Oh, okay.
it didn't specifically talk about being 3 act structure, but the software was set up where like you fill in information and then it tells you kind of what you should have in that
Mm.
scene.
Okay.
And it seemed almost too structured, almost too formulaic, but it was actually really good. And it was good because
Yeah.
it was script writing software.
Yeah.
And this is something that we'll probably talk about over and over again, how I go to scripts more than novel type stuff.
Yeah.
I read a lot of scripts. Whatever. We'll talk about that some other time. But it was script writing software, and I filled that in, and it was a really cool experience because it would tell me, "Hey, you need this kind of event." And it didn't tell you exactly what it had to be, but you need this kind of emotional impact for this scene. And I kind of have to sit there and think about what would I have there? What would these
Right.
characters be doing? So it actually opened my mind up rather than being formulaic and being strict and forcing me down a path. It actually opened up a lot of opportunities for me and made me start thinking about story structure a lot more.
Hmm.
Now, for that particular book, I wish I hadn't published it. That's why I don't even use that pen name anymore because the characters were still kind of cardboard. I did a few things right in that book. It was the first book where I actually did do some good work, but overall it still sucked. Part of it was, because I was using story structure. So yeah, that was my first introduction to it. And then after that, I started actually like, okay, there's something to this. And then I
Yeah.
just started devouring books on story structure.
Yeah.
And seeing
Absolutely.
how many different ones there were, how many similarities there were between them. And yeah, That's kind
Yeah.
of where it went.
Turns out it's a lot.
It is a lot.
It's so many. So many. Cool. Well, I mean, I think we'll probably revisit the three act structure at some point simply because it's gonna kind of be a little bit of a ghost in the machine throughout the whole thing
Yeah.
here. Um,
And it's worth a real deep dive, too.
yeah, absolutely. But for the sake of the first episode, making sure we actually get through two things,
Two
and the
things.
first episode isn't 4 hours long, because God, it could be. We're realizing this now. Um, we're going to talk about our second one. Would you like to introduce that one?
Sure. So it's called Kishotenketsu. So the reason it's so different, it's Eastern Asian. So it started out in China. It's used a lot in Japan, Korea. The pronunciation I just used is the Japanese version.
That's
So
Kishu
Kisho
Ten Kisho
Tenketsu.
Kishotenketsu. Okay.
So it's a 4 act structure, and each one of those words is a different act. So if we get any Japanese listeners, they are going to grill me, and rightly so. But the first one, Kiku or Ki, is the introduction. Now that is very similar to your first act in a Western story.
Yeah.
So you're getting introduced to the character, the plot. There are two main differences, though, between Ki and Act 1. So in Ki, you do not have an inciting incident.
Mm-hmm.
You may not even have conflict.
Mm.
So one of the main things in Western storytelling, get to the conflict as soon as possible, right? If not in the first paragraph, in the first page,
Yeah.
at least in the first 10 pages. In Japanese story structure, you want tension, but you might not need conflict.
Yeah.
The next one is shoku or show. That's the development. Also, what's interesting here is this is not something we discussed in the 3 act structure, but just to go back, a lot of times in the 3 act structure, it's written as like roughly 25% of your story is the Act 1, roughly 50% is Act 2, roughly 25% is Act 3. Now that number gets fudged around a lot, and it should be. It shouldn't be exactly like, should I hit 25% of my word count? I need. No, it's not like that. But this is still different. The introduction or key is usually like 15% or so, 20%. Show is your longest act. The development act is like 50, 60%. It's a big chunk of it. And the interesting part of this is you still don't have an inciting incident. You still might not have conflict. It's all character development, developing the situation, the story, all of that. The next part, Tenku. This is Act 3. So the 10 portion is the twist.
With a twist.
The twist. So this is the interesting portion of it in my mind because it turns the entire story on its head. So it's some kind of twist that upends the character's entire world and basically forces them to change their outlook on everything. Interestingly, though, you still don't need conflict necessarily.
Right.
In fact, there doesn't necessarily have to be conflict in the entire Kishotenketsu.
Yeah.
And then the last part, Ketsu, is the conclusion where everything basically dies down. It is not necessarily a happy ending. In fact, often in Kishotenketsu, they're not happy endings, but it's all about kind of the character coming to terms with whatever happened to them.
Right.
So differences between the Western style and the Eastern style here is it's much more introspective. It's much more about relying on the character's self-development of some kind rather than, fighting off the bad guys.
Right. I have this little graphic here. I'm gonna put it up, and then you can replace it later on with a better graphic if you want it. But yeah, so you can kind of see those percentages there. So the interesting part about this writing style for me is I was trying to look at Hollywood films that fit this form of structure, and there's not a lot,
Mm-mm.
to be fair. In fact, when I was looking into it, most of them were like Studio Ghibli
Yeah.
animes, and then Parasite came up a few times, which again is not really an American film, right? Like
Hmm.
it's wildly loved here in America, but not American by origin. So, but I started like trying to look at a loose version of this, right? Ironically, with the twist, you would think I would go to the fantastic, just amazing works of the greatest director of all time,
Like, can I
Mr. M.
guess
Night
this is?
Shyamalan.
I was gonna guess.
What a twist!
What a twist.
But the ironic thing with that is, for someone who's known as doing the twist, and as much as the twist is emphasized within this structure, he really doesn't do that at all because the twist is the finality of the story, not the setup for where the narration kind of bases off, you know?
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of that. I hadn't tried to go down that road. I kind
Yeah,
of think that the village might,
a little bit.
like, you
A
might be
little
able
bit.
to superimpose Kishotenketsu over the
Yeah.
village. The thing is, I don't want to go back and rewatch that to try to analyze it. Um, that
That's so
that's
fair.
that's not
That's so
something I'm
fair.
willing to do for the sake
Right.
of that experiment. But out of his movies, that's the only one that kind of springs to mind that maybe it fits. But you're right,
Yeah.
like his his twists are like the climax, and then it's over.
Yeah. That's how you're ending, not how you're
Yeah.
almost starting. So then I started looking at four act structures that I felt might, and I had a couple examples, and I was kind of looking at the structure of the movies, and these are loose based on this, but I still think it's worth mentioning. I actually think The Dark Knight would be a good example of a four act structure that drastically changes within it. Now there is conflict and all that stuff, so it is again rough, but
You can have conflict in a Keisha Tenketsu.
right, you
It's
can.
just not
It's just not
necessary.
necessary. Yeah.
Um,
But that was a movie I remember watching and not knowing at the time that in a lot of ways that actually introduced me to a four act structure.
it is
You
four
think the
act.
movie's yeah, you think the movie's over. You think it's done and good. And then it just turns it on its head by taking this amazing character who's been the good guy this entire time, which is Harvey Dent. He turns into Two Face. He frees the Joker. The whole thing kind of goes to hell.
Yeah.
Um, but you don't see it coming. It's a twist. It's a subtle twist, but it's a twist. Um, and it's interesting to me because I wonder someone like Christopher Nolan if that was intentional, um, where he was trying to do something like that or not. Um, and again,
That's
I'm not
interesting.
saying it's not the greatest movie of all time compared to some people. Some people will say it's the greatest movie ever made, but it did stand out to me as that four act structure, which was interesting to me. Just it makes you look at cinema and literary works a little differently, trying to find four act structures where that third act is something that subverts your expectations in a way that drastically changes the ending.
Yeah, I'm not. I kind of want to rewatch that now because I didn't know about Keisha Tenketsu when I watched it. When I
Right.
watched it, I recognized it right away as four act structure. Partially because you're expecting that ending, and then oh wait, we're
Yeah.
starting something new.
Yeah.
You can actually feel it coming, and it's actually why I can't watch that movie like a lot
Right.
because they're partially because they're freaking long, but also
Right.
just
Right.
um, and it is a great film, but the pacing because of the four acts is a little bit different.
It's off-putting because it's something that I don't think we do as Americans. I don't think we do it a lot. But I think there's a lot of good in it. that idea of subverting that expectation of like, oh, you thought this was a simple story about X, Y, and Z, but oh, here we go down this other path. And it's not that the twist has to be,
Yeah,
crazy, but I like the idea that it just kind of takes a left turn.
it does.
It's just it's cool. It's cool. And then you're giving not only are you throwing a twist in there, but you're also giving that twist the love it deserves by giving it its own act, essentially, to tell that part of the story versus just like here's your twist, roll credits,
Yeah.
or the end.
Well, and that's kind of how I came across this too. Um, so when I was writing Me and the Machine, what I do nowadays is once I kind of figure out the idea of the story that I have, I know all of these different story structures. I kind of try on each one, try writing an outline for it. I don't necessarily finish the outline. Maybe I'll get a little bit into it and then realize, okay, this is not the right story structure. Toss it
Yeah.
and kind of start over until I find a story structure that works for that story, and then alter it a little bit as needed. 'Cause, again, these things should be descriptive of what you're trying to do, not prescriptive. Like it's not telling you
Right.
exactly what to do. But yeah, when I was writing Me and the Machine, that doesn't work very well for a 3-act structure. Because again, in the 3-act structure, your inciting incident is in that first act.
Right.
You hear over and over again in writing advice, start as late as you can, start as close to the inciting incident as you can, get to the actual story.
Yeah.
The problem with Me and the Machine, when I was trying to figure that out, is I jokingly called it. Have you seen the 1984 movie with Steven Seagal, Under Siege?
Yeah.
I would jokingly refer to Me and the Machine as it's Under Siege in space, but instead of Steven Seagal, Malcolm in the Middle has to save the day.
I love it.
And that's how I describe it to people, because it's a small kid that's a genius. They can't do much on their own, on a ship during a mutiny that has to try to save the day. But there was so much character development that needed to happen. There was so much of these relationships and everything that had to take place, or that I wanted to take place. The inciting incident would have been the mutiny.
Right.
In this book, the mutiny happens at like 55% or so of the book. And I was like, this is not working. This is, and I started like doubting myself, thinking, "In this book is going to suck." Right? Like nobody's going to want to read this. My early readers actually really liked the story, so that was encouraging. But I was like, something's off about this. And then I found Kishotenketsu, purely by accident. All the reading and stuff I'd read about story structures, I never even heard of it. And I was like, this is what this story is.
Yeah.
And it allowed me to kind of write it the way that I wanted to write it to begin with. And some people might say, well, you should have just written what you wanted to write. You didn't need a story structure for that. And maybe there's some truth to that. But it gives you kind of a little bit of validation and a little bit of a roadmap.
Right.
I don't know. What do you think of that? Like,
No, see, I agree with you. I think whether it's predetermined and thoughtful that this is what I'm going to do, or you just do it, you're still going to fit some mold. There's still going to be some percentage that you go through to get from A to C, or whatever the case may be, that you're going to do. I think having that general idea of the story structure you're going to use, while maybe not needed, is helpful, because it kind of it's like that true north, right? It steers you in the right direction. And I like the idea of, especially nowadays when we have like serialized television shows, where a good example is Game of Thrones, right? Now this isn't this exact thing, but think about how much time in a 10 episode season you spend basically bored. And I'm not saying it's not good, but with character study and all that stuff. And usually it's the ninth episode where something actually happens in those seasons. That's when, shit hits the fan and,
Yeah.
whatever the White Walkers attack or whatever the case may be. There's something special to the idea of taking extra time to not only introduce your characters and grow with them, but hold back on what the whole point of it is, which I think is kind of cool and something that should be appreciated in general from people, and I think it is. So I don't think there's a problem with kind of predetermining that's the direction you're going, or saying, I'm having trouble with this. Is there a story structure that fits what I want to do? Because most of the time you have it in your head. I want to spend 55% of my book really getting to know these characters, and then I want this thing to happen that you don't expect necessarily. Maybe there's pieces, breadcrumbs laid out or whatever, but I think that's smart to know the direction you're going. Because if you're sitting there at 70% and the mutiny still hasn't happened, maybe you should trim some of the fat. You know what I mean?
Right.
So again, it's a guiding compass.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. I downloaded some stuff about this, and it was interesting to me because I thought I'd just throw in Google examples of this, and a bunch of stuff would pop, top 100 books or films that use this story structure. And it doesn't really pop up, but I think the thing that I really like about the story structure is it really is subjective, and it really is, in my mind, almost, it works well with character pieces and just really bringing a lot of attention to the main characters in your story versus just saying, these are the characters, now we're going to throw them into this thing, which is what a 3-act structure generally does. Like you said, first 10 pages, you want to get them out the door, into space. And I do that with a lot of my stuff too. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely.
No. It's actually good advice most of the time.
Most of the time. But I think if you are doing something that's very character driven, where the decisions that the characters make won't make sense unless you spend a lot of time with them, this is a great, great way to do things. So if you're listening right now and you're like, man, yeah, I want to take, Johnny B and throw him into space and have him go on this grand adventure, but he's going to betray his sister, and that doesn't make sense. Well, maybe this is a good example for you to follow, to spend a little bit more time with Johnny B and his sister and just build their relationship, and why maybe he is just going to throw her under the bus, so to speak, the spaceship.
It could be.
I
would say 9 times out of 10 when you're writing something, the 3-act structure is probably the way to go.
Yeah.
And that other 10% of the time, maybe it's one of these other, more esoteric, more like uncommon ones.
Yeah. And it shouldn't be limiting. That's the thing I want to really express to people is you can always change your mind. It's the same thing with outlines. It's the same thing with story structures. You can, and I've done this before, I know exactly where the story is going to end, and I know how it's going to start. But how I get there, sometimes, even if I have had it totally mapped out, you're not necessarily married to that. You might get halfway through and say, you know what? No, I'm going to kill half the characters, something you never thought you would do. Or, a good example is I have a horror novella that I came out with called Petrichor. I won't give away the ending, but it ended on a very, how you would expect it to end on a horror note. Okay. The final, the final scare, if you will. And I showed it to one of my friends who I'm in the writing group with, and he read it, and he said, I love the book, man. It's great. It's like the best thing you've ever written. He's like, God, that ending is awful. I was like, really? It's like, no, it does the horror thing. He goes, exactly. It does the horror thing. You put your character through hell, and then there's no redemption at the end of it. He just goes through hell, and it kind of ends. And so with that in mind, I actually kind of reworked the ending to give it a bit more of a hopeful end. And it was one of the smartest things I did because it totally changed the narrative of the entire story. And it didn't necessarily change the 3-act structure, But I bet if I took it and wrote it down now after I changed that and looked at it, it would probably fit a different structure. Um, and again, that's from someone who loves to stick the landing.
Right.
And it's great to have though a fellow writer just be like,
That is
dude,
a good critique partner.
oh yeah, no, and we're I have a writing group that I'm with that oh yeah, we just rip each other to shreds.
Yeah.
The book I had you read and do like a beta read of Pollyanna in Eternum. They read that about halfway through it before I'd finished it, and they're like, "Oh, I love it, I love it, I love it." And they got to this one part, and then they're just like, "When did you turn into a Hallmark classic film?" I was like, "What do you mean?" They're like, "It just gets so positive." They're like, "I know it's a love story, but my God, like, what are you doing, man? It doesn't sound like you. You're making it's too bubblegum. It's
Is this
too.
the same version I read?
It's not the same version you read.
Okay.
So you know how like in the version you read, there's all these like undertones of like menace is coming. Like that, none of that was there when he first meets the girl. It was just we just had a great time and life was good, and that was it. And they're just like, no, no, no. You're making it sound. And we'll get into this on a future episode, but guys writing female characters. I was notoriously doing the thing that I try never to do, and write like the Garden State treatment is what I call it, which is like the quirky girl who's just out there to save the guy kind of thing. And it was like a really bad call. I was like, no, I'm not writing this as an actual person with their own flaws and all that stuff. But not being married to that is so important. So whether you're doing plot structure or pantsing or not pantsing, whatever want to do on the weekend, just don't be married to it, because at the end of the day, it's just whatever's good for the story. Would be my 2 cents.
No, I 100% agree. And no matter how detailed that outline is, you should have that room you should have that play in the joints.
Absolutely.
And
100%. Well, we're at an hour 4.
Really?
So,
I have a completely different number on here.
Do you really? What's your number?
49:45.
Maybe it's because I bet that's because of when I jumped on here. Well, we want to thank you for joining our first conversation on Fiction in Focus. And next week, we will be talking about, I don't know yet, but we're going to figure it out, and it's going to be entertaining as hell. So we appreciate you listening, and please like, subscribe, ring that bell, whatever else you do with podcasts.
Yeah, and if you're listening or watching this on a platform that has comments, please let us know in the comments, like, what's your favorite story structure? Why? Have you ever heard of these story structures? Hopefully you've heard of the 3-act structure, but who knows? Maybe you haven't.
Are we entertaining, or do we suck?
Oh, we definitely.
It's fine.
We don't need them dancing.
I need validation of the suckage.
Okay. Tell us we suck. Or tell Nathan he sucks. Wesley's pretty
that's
awesome.
fine. Yeah, right? That Wesley guy, man. Just badass. All right. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time.